The text I'm reading from comes from P.V.N. Myers' original publication in 1890 or 1885. So this is an 1885 publication. It's Outlines for Medieval and Modern History, so it covers from the medieval world all the way to the modern period. Of course, this being the middle, late, I could say probably middle part of the 19th century. This history goes all the way from the Teutonic tribes and the Roman Empire in the east. It talks about the Danes in England. It basically goes into feudalism and the Normans. So it starts from the fall of the Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire in 476 to the 11th century, and then from the opening of the 11th century to the discovery of America by Columbus in the year 1492, when he sailed ocean blue. However, this is on the municipalities or the city-states of Italy in the medieval world. The first is Venice, which was the most famous of the Italian republics, and it had its beginnings in the 5th century in the rude huts of some refugees who fled into the marshes out of the Adriatic Sea to escape the fury of the Huns of Attila. Here, secure from the pursuit of the barbarians who were unprovided with boats, they gradually built up on some low islets a number of little villages, which finally, towards the close of the 7th century, coalesced to form a single city, at whose head was placed a ruler bearing the title of Doge, a name designated and destined to acquire a wide renown. And of course, we see the Doge's palace in Venice. Throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, the galleys of the little republic were defending her commerce in the Adriatic against the Norman and the Saracen corsairs. And the Saracens almost rivaled the Romans in their time, or repulsing formidable attacks upon her island home by the barbarians, Slavonians, and Hungarians. For the sake of protection, some Greek cities upon the opposite shore of the Adriatic put themselves under her government. Conquests and negotiations gradually extended her possessions century after century, until she finally came to control the coast and waters of the eastern Mediterranean in much of the same way that Carthage had mastery of the western Mediterranean at the time of the First Punic War. Even before the Crusades, her trade with the East was very extensive, and by those expeditions was expanded into enormous dimensions. The sea between Italy and the ports of Egypt and Syria were literally covered with her transports and war galleys. It will be recalled that she aided the Frank warriors of the Fourth Crusade in their enterprise against Constantinople, and received a share of the spoils, 3/8 of the conquered provinces. Upon this acquisition, the Doge Henry Dandolo assumed the clumsy title Duke of 3/8 of the Roman Empire in the year 1204. Very soon after this, the Venetian Senate gave permission to citizens of the Republic to make such conquests as they might be able in any of the islands about Greece. The conquerors were to hold as vassals of Venice that lands that they might win. Many adventurers took advantage of the opportunity thus afforded, and soon many of the Grecian islands were in possession of ambitious citizens of Venice, and consequently became fiefs or dependencies of the Republic. Venice was at the height of her power during the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. Her supremacy on the sea was celebrated each year by the unique ceremony of wedding the Adriatic by the dropping of a ring into the sea. The origin of this custom was as follows. In the year 177, one of the popes for the pontiffs of Rome had come to think that the sea was well as the land was theirs to dispose of as they pleased, gave a ring to his friend the Doge of Venice with these words, "Take this as a pledge of authority over the sea, and marry her every year, and your successors forever, in order that all may know she is under your jurisdiction, and that I have placed her under your dominion, as a wife is under the dominion of her husband." end quote. The annual celebration of this ceremony was one of the most brilliant spectacles of the Middle Ages, and the decline of Venezia, dates from the 15th century. The conquest of the Turks during this century deprived her of much of the territory that she held east of the Adriatic. And finally, the voyage of Vasco da Gama around the Cape of Good Hope, showing a new path to India, gave a death blow to her commerce. From this time on, the trade with the East was to be conducted from the Atlantic ports instead of from those in the Mediterranean. And of course, then there's Genoa. We'll skip over Genoa for now and go to Pisa. Pisa, located just a little to the south of Genoa on the same coast, was her early rival for supremacy in the waters of the Western Mediterranean. The first battle between the navies of the two republics was fought in 1070. Thenceforward, for 2 centuries, there was carried on an almost continuous war by the rival cities, which finally resulted in the complete destruction of the power of Pisa. Pisa, like Genoa, contains at the present time many monuments dating from the period of her commercial prosperity. Among these is the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa, whose erection was commenced in the year 1174. The inclination of the structure was caused most likely by the sinking of the foundation. Pisa is built in part upon marshy land. The walls of many of its buildings are thrown dangerously out of plumb from the same cause, and the celebrated cathedral, for which the tower was designed as a belfry, has its walls thus injured by the treacherous nature of the ground on which it stands. Before moving to Florence real quick, I'll just talk about Genoa. Genoa is on the western coast of Italy. It was the most formidable commercial rival of Venice. The period of her greatest prosperity dates from the recapture of Constantinople from the Latins by the Greeks in the year 1261. The Genoese, through jealousy of the Venetians, who, it will be remembered, had aided the Frankish crusaders in capturing the city in 1204 and shared with them the provinces of the empire, assisted Michael Palaeologus in the recovery of the throne, and as a reward were given possession of some of the suburbs of Constantinople and of other places among the Bosphorus, which gave them control of the entrance to the Black Sea. Very soon they established ports along the shores of the Euxine and began to carry out a lucrative trade with Eastern Asia by way of that sea and the Caspian Sea. The jealousy with which the Venetians regarded the prosperity of the Genoese led to the oft-renewed war between the two rival republics. For nearly 2 centuries, their hostile fleets contended, as did the navies of Rome and Carthage during the First Punic War, for the supremacy of the sea. The merchants of Genoa, like those of Venice, reaped a rich harvest during the Crusades. The death blow to their prosperity was given by the eruption of the Mongols and Turks and the capture of Constantinople by the latter, the Turks, in the year 1453. The Genoese traders were now driven from the Black Sea, and their traffic with Eastern Asia was completely broken up, for the Venetians had control of the ports of Egypt and Syria and the southern routes to India and the countries beyond. That is, the routes by way of the Euphrates River and the Red Sea. With their old trade route obstructed by the barbarians, the Genoese now sought a new way to the east by sailing westward through the Straits of Gibraltar. The Genoese sailor Columbus was seeking a water path to India, a lifelong dream, when he found the New World. But when at last the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama succeeded in reaching India by doubling the southern cape of the African continent, and Magellan had arrived at the same country by sailing westward and circumnavigating the globe, these discoveries, instead of enabling Genoa to regain the trade and wealth which were slipping from her hands, simply caused her more rapid decline by transferring commercial supremacy from the ports of the Mediterranean to those of the Atlantic seaboard. Genoa still contains many architectural monuments, especially superb palaces, which bear abundant evidence of the genius of her artists and the wealth and magnificence of her merchant princes during that splendid period when the renown of the city republic was spread throughout the world. And then now we'll talk about Florencia. Florence, the most illustrious and fortunate of Italian republics, although from her inland location upon the Arno River, shut off from engaging in those naval enterprises that conferred wealth and importance upon the coast cities of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa became, notwithstanding, through the skill, industry, enterprise, and genius of her citizens, the great manufacturing, financial, literary, and art center of the Middle Ages. The woolen and silk products of her looms and the fine work of her jewelers were famous in all the markets of the world, and indeed famous in gold and leather. Through her banking institutions, she became the money center of Europe during the Middle Ages. The list of her illustrious citizens, of her poets, statesmen, historians, architects, sculptors, and painters, is more extended than that of any other city of medieval times. And indeed, as respects the number of her great men, Florence is perhaps unrivaled by any city of the ancient or modern world, save that of Athens. In her long roll of fame, we find the names of Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Machiavelli, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo Galilei, Amerigo Vespucci, and the Medici. From the 10th century up to the 15th, the government of Florence was for the greater part of the time democratic in form. Occasionally, however, the city would fall into the hands of the nobles or under the power of a usurper, but a sudden uprising of the people usually quickly restored the republic. In no other of the Italian cities were the contentions between certain family feud rivalries so constant and bitter and bloody as within the walls of Florence. The history of the city from the 12th to the 15th century is a most intricate, tedious, and uninstructive record of the interminable quarrels and fightings of the contending factions of families. However, the triumph of one party was usually marked by the massacre or banishment of the leading members of the opposing one. Thus it happened through the changes of fortune that many of the most illustrious citizens of Florence were, at one period or another in their career, sent into exile, just as at Athens under the Republic, ostracism was the fate of almost every person of distinction. Yet, notwithstanding the incessant discord within her walls, Florence, during all these times, continued in growth and wealth, influence and fame, and probably we should not be wrong in thinking that many of the illustrious men to whom the city gave birth during this period of strife and turmoil owed their greatness to the seemingly adverse circumstances amidst which their lives were cast. Certainly the Divine Comedy would never have been written as it was written had Dante had not tasted the bitterness of misfortune, defeat, and exile. It was in the early part of the 15th century that Medici, a family of merchants whom wealth had lifted to the nobility, secured leadership in the political affairs of Florence. At the outset, they veiled their really absolute power under the forms of the Republic, but after a time, the government became an hereditary monarchy in their family. For the greater part of the 15th century, they controlled and watched over the city in a sort of parental way, being greatly loved, honored, and trusted by the Florentines. Their private fortune was a sort of public treasury, freely open to learned men. The two most distinguished names in the house are those of Cosimo de' Medici, who was fondly called the friend of the people and the father of his country, and Lorenzo, his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, who, through the munificent patronage he extended to artists and men of letters, that of philosophy and science, had bestowed upon him the title of the Magnificent. So Lorenzo the Magnificent, the position which Florence held as the center of art during the 15th and 16th centuries, and the reputation she enjoys at the present day on account of her superb palaces, her magnificent churches, and her museums and universities, are due very largely to the taste, discernment, and liberality of these illustrious princes.